Hello, welcome back. Today I'm going to be talking about the 4 game development tools that I use for indie game development, and specifically these are going to be tools that I think are necessary. These 4 things that you have to have, and you don't need anything else. By the way, I'm Savalian. I've been doing professional software development for at least 12 years. I've kind of lost track at this point. And I've been doing game development on the side for pretty much that whole time. With the past 5 years or so being kind of the focused game development time. Before that, I was having to learn how to juggle full-time work and side projects. So in the past 5 years or so, I've really nailed down my process, what I like to make, and how I like to make it. And I think it's easy to get bogged down with all these extra things that you don't really need, fancy software to automate different things, or free assets, really complicated tools. And I think a lot of this is marketing and like a little bit of laziness, not wanting to do the hard work and thinking that all of these extra software tools are going to make it easier for you. But don't worry, all of the 4 things I'm going to describe are easy to find. There are different ways you can sort of fulfill these 4 categories, and in each case there is at least one version that is completely free, so you don't need a bunch of money either. I'll also mention up top that this list is really for solo developers or extremely small team indie developers. If you're on a larger team, if you're with a game company, you don't need to worry about all of this yourself. Most likely there are specific people in roles that handle the things that I'm going to talk about. So this is really for solo developers. But if you're on your own and you want to make a game, you're in the right place. This is all you need. The first tool that you need is a place to store your game designs that is organized and easy to find ideas or thoughts that you've had before, things that you've decided on for your game, and then bonus points if it also works, or if you have a tool that works for a task management system, because unless you're building the world's smallest, most simple game, you are going to have thoughts and ideas that you need to keep track of as you go through the lifespan of your game. And the more weeks or months or even years that it takes to finish your game, the more important this tool becomes, because you're going to have to be revisiting it throughout the lifespan of your game so you don't lose track of what you're making. And I'm struggling with this still, finding the right tool for me, but there are a lot of options, and you can start with something as simple as a bullet journal that you create some spreads that keep track of, where you're brainstorming at, what tasks you have open, things that you would like to have in terms of like art design, progression, different unlocks for the user, Easter eggs even. The bottom line is you need a place to store ideas, and that place that you use to store ideas needs to be searchable, and you need to be able to find older things that you added to the system. So that's the problem I'm working on solving right now. But some of the things I've used for this tool category in the past, I mentioned the journal. I used a bullet journal for game development for a long time before I sort of graduated to a digital tool. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just a little bit hard to find things later because it is analog. I've also used Notion. I've used Notion extensively. I think it works for me best as solely a task manager, so that's kind of its role nowadays. I've also used Obsidian, which I really like for long form notes. I still need to work on my personal skill of tagging and organizing and linking things in Obsidian to get the full value of it. And then right now I'm trying out capacities. We'll see how that goes. I'll probably make a video about it if it ends up being useful for me, but you could also do something a little bit more complicated and a little bit more project focused, like ClickUp. I've made videos about ClickUp before, like whiteboard functionality for brainstorming, especially on a small team. That could be really useful. They also have a whole document section that you can use to store notes and things. There's things like Asana, Jira, which seems kind of heavy-handed for a small team, but you could use it if you want to. I know Trello is a popular one. There's tons and tons of software out there that you could use this for, and then as I mentioned, you could also have some sort of analog system. But that's the first thing, and the best tool is going to be something that is easy for you to add to and to find things later. Those are the two things that you need. Next, and probably the thing that people think about first when they want to make a game, I think the design portion should be first, but the second thing is the engine. So if you don't know what an engine is or does, if you're very brand new to game development, what an engine is basically a foundation, a platform on which to build your game. So games have a lot of things that they need to do that are extremely tedious to build in terms of code, and they've already been solved. So things like rendering graphics, things like physics calculations, things like managing the timing, the game loop in the game, things like loading and unloading different sorts of assets and managing groups of them in scenes. All of this stuff you need to have for most games in some form or another, and you don't need to build it from scratch every time. We have engines for that. And so you could build your own engine. That is an option. I really wouldn't recommend it for anything other than sort of a fun project that you want to do, because it's a lot of work, and it's a lot of very low level work, and it's not going to result in creating a game faster. For pretty much every video game beginner, I would recommend using one of the mainstream engines that is available. So which one should you pick? This could be its own video as well. I'm going to give you the short version because in the end, it doesn't matter that much, especially if you're a beginner, because unless you're like 2 years into a game that you've been making, switching engines is not that difficult, it's not that complicated. So I would recommend trying out engines, looking at how they work and figuring out what works for you best. But for about 10 years I used Unity. If you've been on this channel before, you'll know that about a year ago, Unity made a lot of decisions that kind of broke my trust that they had, developers' interests in mind when they were making business decisions. It was a really bad feeling, and even though they have since walked back a lot of the decisions that they made and sort of were like, okay, sorry, it left a really bad taste in my mouth, and I didn't really want to continue working with a company that could just do that, who had a history of making big decisions like that, with no apparent regard for how the customers were affected. But, all in all, if I had to recommend an engine to somebody, Unity's probably still pretty good. I haven't kept up with it since I've stopped using it. When I was using it, there were a lot of systems that were kind of getting outdated. I know I've talked about the UI systems before, where it's just like they keep creating new UI systems and never fully finishing them or fully integrating them with the other parts of the engine. So I think it's probably still fine. Games still get made in Unity, but it's not my personal choice. I moved from Unity to Godot, which is a free open source engine that for a long time I think people kind of didn't recommend for 3D games. But as of 4.0, which was released sometime before I switched to it, so I never used an older version of Godot, it's perfectly fine for all of the things that I have needed to do. So I'm really liking Godot. I do think there is still a little bit of a lack of documentation, especially if you would like to use C#, which is supported by the engine. GDScript is sort of their built-in language, and I might try that at some point. I'm going to see if maybe it feels a little bit better to use in the editor. But because it is open source, it relies a lot on community, community posts, forums, people adding to the documentation out of the goodness of their heart. So it can be a little bit challenging to get into Godot if you have no experience coding whatsoever. So that's kind of the one thing that makes me a little hesitant to recommend it to ultimate beginners. But if you are a developer, if you understand code at a basic level and you're looking for an engine to use, 10 out of 10 I would recommend it. It works. It's free. It's a lot more popular now, partially because of the Unity thing, and it's always getting better, you know? And then the last mainstream engine that I am aware of is Unreal, and I have some mixed feelings about Unreal. I won't get too far into them because I've never used it. I don't have any personal experience with Unreal, but I feel like Unreal is extremely heavy, both in terms of learning how to use it. I feel like there's a lot of, it feels like a very proprietary piece of software that you need to specifically learn how to use. And then also, like, you see all of these very impressive reels of what Unreal Engine can do. So you see, like, you know, the open world scene with all the global illumination and like the cliff face with like 1,000 million vertices each individually rendered, and I think that's very cool. It's very impressive. It's very cool. I think Unreal is probably a great choice if you are making an extremely realistic open world game. But I think when people see that, they think, oh, I can just plug in my ideas and it will create this beautiful game. And that's not how it works. You still need the art assets to support a game that looks like that. You still need to have that. You need to have those resources and that expertise to make use of Unreal and to its fullest degree. So it feels like a lot, and it feels like it promises a lot. I personally would recommend something a lot lighter, something easier to learn and work with than just going straight into Unreal. But do whatever makes you happy. Ultimately, every mainstream game engine is going to have roughly the same capabilities. There's not a lot of like specific stuff that is exclusive to one engine. I would really recommend just picking the one that feels best to you and just going with it, just starting to learn, because I think if you spend too much time trying to weigh all these different features for the engines, that's time that you're not using doing the work and making the game. The third tool, I had to decide if I wanted to split this out because this is often sort of integrated with the engine's editor, but in my case it typically hasn't been, and that is the code editor or the IDE, the development environment, something like that. I feel like a lot of the game engines either come packaged with an editor for code, or that it's literally built into the interface. So like Godot has GDScript, which is has a window that you could just type GDScript right into in the editor, but you can also connect it to Visual Studio or other code editors if you'd like to. I think Unity is packaged with Visual Studio now. I'm not sure what Unreal uses. I know Unreal has a lot of like visual scripting tools, their blueprint system, so I'm not actually totally sure what sort of code you write with Unreal. I know it's C++ code, and that's basically the extent of my knowledge. But I think there are a few things you want to look for when you're picking a code editor to use. The first one is gonna sound silly, but it should be nice to look at. And you may not think that, you know, the color theme of your code editor is important, but you're gonna be looking at it a lot. And eye strain is a very real problem. It can cause a lot of problems if you're like me, if you use computers all day, every day, and your eyes start to hurt. That sucks. So you want to make sure that you use an editor that is easy on the eyes, the contrast is right, the colors are right. If you're in a very dark environment, you don't want a light mode editor because the brightness is going to be very harsh on your eyes. So you want to pick something that is easy to look at, and then of course you still want to be taking breaks from the computer, breaks from the screens. Take care of your eyes. I know I'm not as good about this as I could be, but it is important to take care of your eyes. You need them to see. The second thing to consider when picking a code editor is how well does it integrate with your engine of choice. Ideally, you can press one button and execute the code you've just written. This gets a little bit complicated when you have like different scenes and things like that. Like games typically don't run like just sequentially from a file like a script. Typically you have a scene that loads certain bits of code in and they run in the game loop. But ideally there should be a very short path between writing code and running the code. And then the last thing, a little similar, is how well does it allow you to debug your code? So there's a difference between running the code and debugging the code. Debugging implies that you can see something about what's running that will allow you to fix things that are wrong. So ideally you are able to set breakpoints, which will stop the execution of the code at a certain point so that you can inspect what's happening. Ideally, it lets you view the value of variables at runtime. So sometimes you can do this in the game engine editor's inspector. This has been a little bit challenging with Godot for me. I feel like I don't quite have a system where I can easily debug. But this is what you want to look for. You want to make sure that what you're using works well when things are going wrong, because that's when you need to rely on it most. The code editor is going to be your constant companion, unless of course you do exclusively visual scripting, in which case you can probably throw out this entire section of the video. But if you are writing code yourself, you're going to need this. So make sure you have a look at what's out there. Like I mentioned, I've been using Visual Studio kind of by default. It's what I kind of learned first, but there are other options out there if you'd like to explore a little bit. And the fourth and last tool I'm going to talk about that you need for game development is an art creation tool. And I'm going to use this time to spotlight my personal favorite, Blender. Now you might be wondering, isn't Blender just for 3D? No, Blender actually has a fully integrated painting space with you could do 2D animation in Blender if you want to. It's even got a video editor. And fun fact, for a long time, Blender had a game engine in it. I've actually used the Blender game engine. I've been using Blender since it was at 1.0. It was a long time ago. It was a really long time ago. I don't like to think about how long ago that was. They've since stripped out the game engine, but Blender does everything a 3D modeling software should do, and then a bunch of stuff that you would never expect a 3D modeling software to do. But being serious, if you're gonna make a game, I think you need to be able to create or at least impact the art and the art style. I'm joking when I say that you should use Blender for 2D. There are other things that are probably better. I know for pixel art, Aseprite is the only one I ever see anyone use. For 2D that's not pixel art, there's a lot of painting programs that are probably better. I like Krita for 2D things. Blender is a great option for 3D, and I would recommend it, especially if you don't have $8 million to pay for one of the industry standard 3D software. But whatever you choose, I would highly recommend learning to create art for your game, even though it is quite hard. And this is because I see a lot of games, and there's no hate on these developers, I'm not dragging them. There's a lot of games that only use purchased publicly available asset packs to create their games. And while I think that's fine for learning and ultimately they're making sales, it's fine for commercial games as well. I think something is lost here where the game that you make ends up looking and feeling exactly like a dozen other games. And so you lose that sense of life and originality that only you can add to the game. Because you're not adding it, you're letting someone else add it for you. I think if you have at least the major assets created for your game, or perhaps you get an asset that's been made already, like a character, and you customize it. You add a painted texture, or you adjust the proportions to, emphasize certain parts of the character that are related to your game. I think that's going to do so much to bring out the spirit that is in the design. The spirit that only you can add. And I think it's also going to make the art feel more cohesive if you can align it with each other. You have a lot of these sort of asset flip games that feel very disjointed. It feels like you can tell that 5 different people made the assets for the game and they were not in communication with each other about what the game should look like. There's also some indie games like Going Under, Omori, Balatro, Papers, Please, where the custom art, the original art, what added a layer of meaning to the game. Like in Going Under, the art style was chosen for a very specific reason that added commentary on corporate culture that they wouldn't have had if they just used a typical humanoid character model. Imagine if Balatro was the same game, same mechanics, but none of the art was original and it was just like photos of playing cards. It wouldn't feel the same, it wouldn't have the same effect, and it probably wouldn't have done as well. And art doesn't have to be extremely complex or extremely high skill. You don't need to do art for 20 years to learn how to make art for games. You can learn a simple style and you can make it your own without, that level of commitment. But I would recommend trying it out. If you're not suited for art for whatever reason, I would recommend working with an artist, commissioning work if you have to, because I think it really adds something. But those are the 4 tools that I think are necessary for indie game development. We've got what I'm calling the idea space, the design space, we've got the engine, we've got the code editor, and we've got the art creation program. Get these things nailed down, and then you're ready to get started on the fun part and also the hard part, actually making the game. I know, it's not as easy as it sounds, but the sooner you get started, the sooner you can grow and the sooner you can learn. The sooner you're done, in theory. But I hope this helped. Let me know in the comments, do you think I missed anything? Do you think there's a big category of game creation tool that I left out? Leave it in the comments. And please like this video and subscribe because it really helps me out. It helps other people like you find this video and give it a watch. And again, I'm Savalian. I typically make videos about games development and creativity. I'll be back soon with another video, and I hope to see you there. Alright, bye-bye.